and he's got the responsibility, as it says here, for driving the IBM strategy, sales, enablement, and technical pre-sales for software running on Linux and other open sources environment. In short, he's your kind of people. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bob Sutor.
Thank you. All right, let's switch screens here. Come on, Firefox, behave. All right. So with a title like this, how could I avoid telling you terrible things, right? I mean, landmines are terrible things. They do explode and things like this, but this is not really intended to be a downer of a presentation. I was listening very carefully as Zonker was talking this morning, you know, whether the glass is half full, half empty. I generally think it's half full. I don't usually believe it's poison, but I always look at who's handing me the glass first and then make that decision. So clearly, you know, open source is hot. That's why you're all here. Arguably, mobile is even hotter, right? Between iPhones and Android phones and all sorts of new things that people are trying to come up with. So I thought it'd be an interesting experiment to try to combine the two and really look at whether it really even made sense to combine the two. I think a lot of you have heard snippets here and there of what open source may have to do with mobile. It's a complicated story. And so what I want to do here is really start with a basic assumption which says, let's say you really wanted open source to own the mobile space, right? So you really believe in open source, you like this notion of freedom, you like this notion of source code available for reuse, you like giving away everything you do to other people so they can make it better and figure out a way of making money that you never thought of, and things like this. What's going to stand in the way, right? So, you know, certainly many open source projects have been amazing successes. Linux, of course, Eclipse, almost everything that Apache touches, right? But what about this mobile space? And I'm not talking, by the way, about what happens in the telcos, right? Those mysterious things that happen when the waves travel back and forth between your mobile device, your phone, your smartphone, and then whatever it is it does on the other side, what infrastructure they happen to use. I'm really going to be talking about the phones themselves and programming for the phones themselves. So here are the key questions. We're going to start with, and I'd like you to think about as I go through this. So how significant is open source for developers and users of mobile apps? I'm mostly focusing on developers, but we should think about users. And so that means you, right? So that means when you have your smartphone, whatever it may happen to be, and you look at it and you look at the apps available, you say, how significant is it to me that any of these are or are not open source? And do I know and do I care? And should I care? All right? Has open source already achieved a significant foothold in the mobile space? And you can measure significant in different ways. You can measure in terms of number of apps, right? That's one thing. Though it's nice to know how many people have downloaded those apps. You could also measure in terms of revenue. Right? So is there one app, right, that's made a lot of money, right? Angry Birds. Right? Will the T's and C's, the terms and conditions of the different app marketplaces, stall the use of open source? Is that going to be a problem? Those are contracts, in fact. You know, we've already heard a little bit this morning about there may be some clashes. And then more generally, as the title says, you know, what landmines may hinder the adoption of open source. So the way to do this, I decided to do this was several weeks ago on my blog, was to put up early thoughts on this. And I thought this would be a nice collaborative open source way of doing it because I felt that if I put a few things about this, people could tell me, one, I was being really stupid and I shouldn't say those things because that's a good collaborative thing. And if there was anything I was really missing, right? So here open source thinks security, holes, whatever, somebody would in fact tell me. So luckily, people didn't too much tell me I was really stupid about any of these things. I'll point out a couple of areas where they did it, and they did fill in a few gaps. So thank you to people on Facebook and Twitter and so forth, the blog, who have contributed. So I narrowed it down to these 5 landmines, and these are the ones I will go through over the next few minutes. All right? And so these are just the headings, and we'll talk about them. So, the first one, no GPL code allowed in apps for the Apple App Store. Second one is sloppy open source license compliance. Third one is the right code. Again, remember, you're a developer, right? You want to create something. There's code out there. You want to use it. The right code is available, that's under the wrong license. Fourth one, there's not enough money in it. Now, that's pretty general. That's not just open source. But I'll try to look at what that means for people who are involved with open source. And then the fifth one, also, again, you don't necessarily have to limit it to open source, but it's good to look at from that angle. Getting heard among the noise of thousands of other app developers. And I'll look a little bit at what that means. All right, so the first one, no GPL code allowed in apps for the Apple App Store. So let's look at a real app marketplace and some of the conditions. It says excluded license means any license requiring as a condition of use, modification, and/or distribution of the software subject to the license that the software or other software combined and/or distributed with it be disclosed or distributed. That's a bad thing. You're forced to disclose or distribute. License for the purpose of making derivative works, or redistributable at no charge. Excluded licenses include, but are not limited to, the GPL v3 licenses. And it goes on and on and on. Okay? So that's pretty explicit if you're interested in free software, right? And particularly the GPL, saying, don't bother. It's not going to work. All right? Now, do you care? Well, it turns out this is Microsoft's license. What a shock they're saying this, to tell you the truth. Okay? But what about Apple? I mean, Apple really is the leading one that's out there, right? So it's one thing to worry about who's number one in terms of volumes, or arguably number two, depending on who you talk to, and who's number five. But what about Apple, all right? And here, Apple has been oddly silent about the GPL in particular, right? So the GPL, General Public License, is by far in the world of free and open source software the most commonly used. Let's say that with plus or minus 5%, 70% of all free and open source projects use the GPL. Pretty sizable. And the plus or minus is depending on who's counting, but 65 to 75%. So the Free Software Foundation argues that the terms and conditions in the Apple App Store apply to any GPL software that goes in there. The terms limit the usage rules, right? So the App Store does limit what you can do with those apps that you download, right? And in particular, they conclude that the restrictions that Apple places on apps do not allow you to use GPL v2. All right? So this is the Free Software Foundation. These are the people who provided the license. Now, there's a fair amount of discussion and occasionally acrimony in the community about this. And whenever you say it's not allowed in the Apple App Store, someone raises their hand very quickly and say, but it's not Apple saying that, it's just somebody who says you can't do that, and so forth. You know, folks, this is the Free Software Foundation. They wrote the GPL, right? If they're saying it doesn't work, you should listen to this. So some GPL software has been removed from the App Store, some still remains. It's a strange situation, okay? So what are you going to do about it? And so for each of these landmines, by the way, I'm going to try to give you something more positive and constructive on the other side. So first of all, you have to understand the legal terms and conditions for each app store. So no longer do you need to just read the legalese in the open source licenses you're using. You have to look at the App Store and what it says and figure out whether it's compatible and whether or not you really want to go to law school or you can find a friend and things like this. All right? If reaching the iPhone and iPad users is important to you, right? iPhone, iPad, been moderately successful in the last couple of years. Consider using licenses like BSD, Apache, and Eclipse, right? They generally seem to be okay. You do need to, even though Apple has been largely quiet and other people have forced the GPL applications to come down, I wouldn't be too shocked if at some point in the future Apple was much more explicit about this. I mean, Microsoft was explicit, Apple is explicit about this. Now, if you don't care about things being in the Apple App Store, more power to you. You don't have to worry about this. But if you do care, you have to know this, and that's really my message. And the fourth thing of what you could try to do is to try to convince Apple to carve out more GPL-friendly rules. Stranger things have happened, right? So that is there a way of lobbying Apple? Not that they always listen very carefully to what others want to do, but is there a way of actually getting some usage in the App Store with an understanding of GPL, its rules, and so forth that will make everybody happy? It intersects with questions and technologies like DRM, all sorts of things like this. A lot of things would have to be changed, but I put it there as a possibility. Okay, the second area is sloppy open source license compliance. Now that's, as a landmine, it's not good to be sloppy, right? And this is the point. And so here I'm using, I apologize without permission, but it was a public press release, so I decided to do it, and they're here. And thank you very much, OpenLogic. Thank you very much, Stephen. Okay. OpenLogic, please go to their booth. Okay. So this was released at the Andicon, or? Right, several weeks ago. And basically, they did a survey, as it says here, of 635 leading mobile applications. Among other findings, the results show that 71% of Android, iPhone, and iPad apps containing open source failed to comply with basic open source license requirements. All right? Now, that's not good. That's sloppy, okay? You can fix these things, right? And you can go to their website, and I have the URL. And by the way, on my website, sutor.com, there's this whole presentation, so all the URLs are in there, and you can get that. That just went up. So from the perspective of getting credibility for open source and wider use of open source in this space, you have to follow the rules. And you can't just say, that's cool free code, and I'm just going to plug it in. And I'm not going to give attribution, and I'm not going to give a copy of the license, or if it's GPL or something like this, right, I'm not going to give people a chance to download the full source code and things like this.